The morning Gilbert Lockhart rode into Dusk Creek, New Mexico territory. 3 separate men pulled him aside before he even hitched his horse, each one wearing the same expression a man wears when he is about to say something that sounds like a warning but is really a confession of his own defeat. It was the spring of 1882, and the territory was the kind of place that chewed through men the way a river chews through soft sandstone, slowly at first, then all at once. Gilbert had come from Abilene with a leather satchel, a surveying kit, and a letter of introduction from a land acquisition company out of Santa Fe that wanted someone reliable enough to measure the parcels along the Pecos River before the railroad men arrived, and started making promises nobody could keep. He was 28 years old, broad-shouldered but not imposing, with steady gray eyes and the particular kind of quiet that people either trusted immediately or found deeply unsettling. He had a reputation for being thorough, and in his line of work, thoroughness was the only currency that held its value. The first man who warned him was the liveryman, a heavy-set fellow named Orson Beat who had the look of someone who had witnessed too many things and processed too few of them. He took Gilbert's roan stallion by the bridle and said, without being asked, "You staying in town long, mister?" Gilbert said he expected to be in the area 3 or 4 weeks, depending on the land. Orson Beat shook his head slowly, as if Gilbert had announced his own death. "You'll want to sort out your business before you go introducing yourself to Adelaide Finley," he said, "because once you meet her, you won't be thinking straight about anything else. And then when she outlasts you like she outlasts every man who comes through here thinking he's got something to offer, you'll lose the thread entirely. I've seen it happen 6 times. Gilbert tilted his head. "Outlasts? She's still here," Orson said. "Every man who thought he could match her pace, help her carry her load, keep up with her sense of purpose, they're all gone. Some moved on. Some just gave up before they started. She didn't break them, understand, she didn't mean to. She just kept going, and they couldn't." Gilbert pulled his saddlebag free and draped it over his shoulder. "I appreciate the counsel," he said, and walked toward the boarding house. He did not get 50 feet before the second man stopped him. This one was younger, maybe 19 or 20, with a fresh sunburn and the eager look of someone who had recently suffered an embarrassment he was still processing. He introduced himself as Clem Hatcher, and he said, unprompted and at moderate speed, that Adelaide Finley ran the dry goods store on the corner of Main and 2nd, and that she had the finest mind in Dusk Creek and possibly in 3 surrounding counties, and that he had tried to court her for 8 months before realizing she was operating on a plane he simply could not reach, and that this was not her fault but it was a fact. "You're telling me all this because?" Gilbert asked. "Because you look like the kind of man who might try," Clem said earnestly, "and I respect that. I just want you to know going in." "Know what exactly?" "That she will outlast you," Clem said. "She outlasts everyone. She's the most capable woman I have ever encountered in my life, and I mean that as the highest praise I know how to give, and also as a warning because capable means she doesn't need a single thing you have to offer, and that is a hard truth to sit with when you're in the middle of caring about somebody." Gilbert studied him for a moment. "How old are you, son?" 20, Clem said. "You learned something important," Gilbert told him. "Not everyone learns it at 20. He touched the brim of his hat and continued walking. The third man was waiting on the porch of the boarding house itself, as if he had been stationed there specifically for this purpose. He was older, perhaps 55, with a white-streaked beard and the sun-creased complexion of a man who had spent decades outdoors doing something that required both physical labor and careful observation. He introduced himself as Rupert Finley and said he was Adelaide's father. Gilbert stopped walking. "Heard the liveryman already got to you," Rupert said, not unkindly, "and probably young Hatcher too." "They mentioned your daughter," Gilbert allowed. Rupert Finley looked at him with an expression that contained equal parts pride and something that might have been grief if it had not been tempered by so much admiration. "She runs that store herself," he said. "Has since her mother passed 3 years back. Before that she helped me with the supply ledgers, the inventory, negotiated with 3 different wholesalers in Santa Fe, and never came out worse than even. usually came out ahead. She reads law books for pleasure. She has an opinion on the water rights situation along the Pecos that I believe is more legally sound than anything the county judge has put forward. He paused. I'm not bragging. I'm establishing facts. All right, Gilbert said. She has been courted, Rupert continued, by the sheriff, by a man who owned 400 acres east of here, by a traveling minister who thought he could offer her salvation and ended up questioning his own, and by young Clem Hatcher who you probably already spoke with. None of them could hold her attention past the initial pleasantries. She's not cold, you understand. She's warm. She's good. She laughs at things that are genuinely funny instead of things that are merely expected to be. But she moves at a pace that most men find disorienting. She has a life that is fully inhabited. She does not need to be completed. Gilbert was quiet for a moment. The wind came down the main street, lifting a little dust, carrying the smell of horse and cedar and distant rain. With respect, sir, Gilbert said, why are you telling me this? Rupert Finley tilted his head and studied him. Because you're the first man I've seen ride into this town who looked like he might actually listen to the warning and still want to meet her anyway. He stood up from his chair. Rooms $3 a week, meals included. Dinners at 6. Gilbert Lockhart set his saddlebag down on the porch step and said, very calmly, I appreciate the warning, Mr. Finley. Truthfully, that sounds like the kind of woman I have been looking for my entire adult life. Rupert stared at him. Then slowly he began to laugh. It was a deep, genuine laugh, the kind that sounds like relief. Son, he said, you had better be telling the truth. I don't have any particular talent for lying, Gilbert said. It wastes everyone's time. Rupert opened the boarding house door and gestured him inside. Dinner at 6, he repeated. Adelaide usually eats with me on Tuesdays. Today is Tuesday. Gilbert walked in. He set his hat on the rack by the door. He placed his saddlebag beside the bed in the room Rupert showed him, unpacked his surveying kit with careful and practiced hands, and for the rest of the afternoon he sat at the small desk by the window and reviewed the land maps the Santa Fe Company had sent him. But he will not pretend, even to himself in memory, that he was thinking entirely about the land. Adelaide Finley arrived at her father's boarding house at 6 minutes past 6, which Gilbert would later learn was not because she was careless about time, but because she had stopped on the way over to help Mrs. Osgood, the milliner's wife, carry in a delivery of fabric bolts that had arrived late from Albuquerque, and which the delivery man had left stacked outside the door in a way that guaranteed at least 2 would be damaged by the morning dew if they stayed out. Adelaide had taken note of this on her way past, assessed the situation, and handled it, which was exactly how she handled most situations that presented themselves to her. Directly, without ceremony, and without waiting for someone else to step forward first. She came through the boarding house door with the evening light behind her, and Gilbert was already at the table with her father, and when she walked in she did not look immediately at him, which he appreciated, because it meant when she did look at him it was a deliberate choice rather than a reflex. She was 26 years old. She had dark brown hair pinned up in the practical way of a woman who has better things to do than fuss over it, though a few strands had escaped and were doing what they liked along the side of her face. She had sharp, direct eyes, the color of good, strong coffee, and the kind of posture that came not from self-consciousness but from genuine physical confidence. She wore a dark blue dress that had been mended at one cuff with thread that was only approximately the right shade, which told Gilbert she had mended it herself and had not particularly cared whether it matched exactly because the dress was functional and the function was the point. You must be the surveyor, she said, sitting down across from him and reaching immediately for the bread basket. Gilbert Lockhart, he said. You must be Miss Finley. Adelaide, she said, without looking up from the bread she was cutting. Miss Finley is what the circuit judge calls me when he's about to tell me something condescending. Her father made a sound that was half cough and half suppressed amusement. What's the survey for? She asked, passing the bread to her father. A land acquisition company in Santa Fe wants accurate parcel measurements along the Pecos before the railroad survey team arrives in the fall, Gilbert said. They want to know what they're dealing with before anyone starts making claims. Which company? She asked. He told her. She nodded, chewing thoughtfully. They're legitimate, she said. I've dealt with their purchasing agent. He's fair, or at least fairer than most. You should know that the Dahlin land along the East Bank has a boundary dispute that's been running for 11 years, and neither party has filed correctly with the Territorial Land Office, because neither party can agree on which Territorial Land Office has jurisdiction, which is a question that actually has a clear answer if you look at the Congressional Act from 1850 and the subsequent amendment, but apparently neither of them has done that. Gilbert set down his fork. How do you know which congressional act? I read it, she said simply. You have a copy of the 1850 Congressional Act. I have several land-related documents that my mother ordered from a legal publisher in St. Louis before she died. She believed property rights were going to be the defining issue of the territory for the next 50 years. Adelaide glanced up at him. She was right, obviously. She sounds like an exceptional woman, Gilbert said. She was, Adelaide said. There was a brief, controlled pause. The documents are in the store in the back office. I've organized them. If you need to review the Dahlin dispute before you survey those parcels, you're welcome to. Gilbert looked at her steadily. That would save me a significant amount of time. I know, she said. That's why I offered. They ate dinner. Rupert Finley told a story about a mule that had escaped his corral 3 years ago and been found 14 months later in Colorado, which was a story of moderate entertainment value, and appeared to be told primarily to fill space, while his daughter and the new boarder continued looking at each other with the particular measured attention that two observant people pay to someone they suspect might be interesting. After dinner, Adelaide helped clear the table, which she did without being asked and without making anything of it, and then she said good night to her father and put on her coat and said to Gilbert, without quite looking at him, "The store opens at 7. If you come before 8, I can show you those documents before the morning customers arrive." "I'll be there at 7:30, Gilbert said. She nodded once and went out the door. Rupert Finley poured 2 small glasses of whiskey, set one in front of Gilbert, and said nothing whatsoever. He just looked at the door through which his daughter had exited, with an expression on his face that Gilbert would later describe as watchful hope. Gilbert was at the store at 7:20, because he had been awake since 5 and had already completed his preliminary map review and could not convincingly pretend to himself that he was going because of the documents. Adelaide was already open. She was behind the main counter entering numbers in a ledger with a focus so complete she did not immediately register the bell above the door, and Gilbert stood just inside for a moment and watched her work. She had a pencil tucked behind her ear and another in her hand. The store was immaculately organized in a way that suggested not military rigidity but genuine systematic thinking. The goods arranged not by convention, but by the logic of who needed what and where they were likely to be standing when they needed it. Flour and salt and sugar near the door, because people bought them most often and should not have to navigate the whole store. Hardware toward the back where men who knew what they needed could go directly to it. Medicinal supplies behind the counter where she could control access and advise properly. "You rearrange the standard dry goods layout," he said. She looked up. "Good morning. Yes. The traditional layout assumes the shopkeeper's convenience rather than the customer's. I tried it the traditional way for 6 months and then reorganized. Sales went up 12%. How do you track that precisely?" "Ledgers," she said, holding up the book she was writing in. "Every transaction, every product, every week compared against the same week the previous year, adjusted for population changes in the area." She set down the pencil. "The documents are in back. Come through." The back office was small and lit by a single good window that faced east so it got the morning light. The documents were in a wooden cabinet with hand-labeled drawers, and Adelaide pulled out the correct one without hesitation because of course she knew exactly where it was, and spread the papers on the work table. She walked him through the relevant sections with the ease of someone who had read them many times and thought carefully about what they meant. She explained the Congressional Act, the Boundary Amendment, the history of the Dahlan dispute including the names of the relevant parties, the nature of the competing claims, and what a properly filed resolution would require. She did this with precision and without condescension, as if she were simply transferring information from one competent person to another, which was exactly how Gilbert received it. When she finished, he sat back and looked at her. "You should have been a lawyer," he said. "Yes," she agreed. "The territory doesn't permit women to sit the bar, which I find both legally questionable and practically idiotic, since the shortage of competent legal minds in this region is well documented." She said this without particular bitterness, just as a matter of factual record. "I do what I can with what I have." "You do considerably more than what I would expect," he said. "More than you would expect, or more than the average person in this town would expect." He thought about it honestly. "Both," he said, "but when I say it, I mean it as a recognition, not a qualification." She looked at him for a moment. "Most men who say something like that are actually trying to find the edges of what I'm capable of," she said, "to locate the ceiling." "I'm not," he said. "I'm a surveyor. I measure things accurately. I'm not interested in finding your ceiling. I'm interested in knowing the actual shape of the territory." There was a pause. Outside, the first customer of the morning opened the front door, and the bell rang, and Adelaide straightened and moved toward the front without hurry, and Gilbert gathered his notes and followed her out, and the morning began in earnest. He spent the first full week surveying the land parcels west of town, which were straightforward and presented no particular complications. He rose early, packed his equipment, and rode out before most of the town was awake. He was methodical and precise, measuring twice, recording carefully, noting anomalies in the landscape that the existing maps had missed or misrepresented. He returned each evening before dinner and spent an hour updating his field notes at the desk in his room. He stopped at Adelaide's store every morning, not always for the documents, though he did work through the Dahlan boundary materials over several sessions. Sometimes he bought things he needed: rope, ink for his notes, a new leather strap for his instrument case. Sometimes he bought things he did not urgently need because it gave him a reason to be there. He was aware of this and did not pretend otherwise to himself. She knew he was coming in more often than strictly necessary. She was too observant not to know. She did not say anything about it, but she began, around the third day, to have his specific ink ready on the counter when he arrived. And around the fifth day, she started a pot of coffee in the back office at 7 o'clock because she had noticed he looked like a man who thought better with coffee in him. The town was observing all of this with the focused attention that small towns in 1882 applied to the only drama more compelling than a land dispute or a card game, which was the possibility of a love story. Clem Hatcher, who was genuinely good-natured despite his heartbreak, stopped Gilbert outside the feed store on the sixth day and said, "You're holding up better than most." "I'm not competing with anyone," Gilbert said. "No, I know," Clem said. "That's why you're holding up. Most men who came through here tried to be impressive. You just seem to be trying to be useful." "Usefulness is underrated," Gilbert said. Clem thought about this. "She said something like that once," he said. "Almost exactly that. She said the men she met were always trying to be impressive, and that impressive without useful was just theater." He paused. "I don't think she meant it as advice. I think she was just observing something, but I took it as advice." "That's the right way to take it," Gilbert said. On Saturday of the first week, there was a dispute at the Dahlan property. Gilbert had been surveying the eastern boundary and encountered one of the Dahlan men, a compact and red-faced fellow named Marcus, who informed him with considerable emphasis that no outsider was going to come measuring his land, and that the Santa Fe Company could take their letters of introduction and their fancy instruments and go back to wherever they came from. Gilbert listened to all of this with patience. He explained his purpose, his authorization, the nature of the company's interest, and the fact that an accurate survey would almost certainly benefit the Dahlen claim as much as the competing claim, possibly more, since the existing maps put the eastern boundary 50 feet short of where it probably actually was. Marcus Dahlen went from hostile to suspicious to cautious to interested over the course of about 20 minutes, which was a conversion Gilbert had made many times, and which required primarily that he say accurate things in a calm voice and wait for reason to assert itself. When he rode back to town that evening and stopped at the store, Adelaide was just locking up and he told her what had happened. "You told him about the 50 feet, she said. "I did. Smart," she said. "He's stubborn but not stupid. Once he understood you weren't working against him, he would have settled down." She paused, keys in her hand, looking at him in the slant of the late afternoon light. "A lot of men would have just insisted on their authority and made an enemy." "Making enemies takes energy," Gilbert said, "and they rarely produce good information." She looked at him for a moment longer than she might have. The evening was warm, the kind of warm that New Mexico territory produced in late spring that felt like a promise rather than a threat. The light was orange gold, and it was doing very flattering things to the dust on the main street and the worn wood of the storefronts and the dark blue of Adelaide's dress. "Do you want to take a walk?" she said. It came out slightly more direct than she perhaps intended, and she seemed aware of this, but she did not retract it. "I would like that very much," Gilbert said. They walked north along the main street, and then off it along a track that led toward a dry creek bed that in the rainy season filled with fast cold water, but now was just pale sand and smooth stones, and the smell of whatever had been water recently. Adelaide knew the path without looking at it. She told him about the creek, how it flooded every 3 or 4 years, how her mother had loved to walk along it after rain, how the wild sage came up along the banks in late summer and filled the whole air with the kind of smell that she associated with everything she had loved about her childhood. Gilbert listened. He asked questions at the right intervals, not to fill silence but because he genuinely wanted to know more, and she could tell the difference, and it did something to the quality of her voice. It relaxed, it opened. It became less like a woman who is used to being tested and more like a woman who is simply speaking to someone she trusts. She asked about his work, and he told her honestly, the beginning in Ohio, the apprenticeship under a civil engineer in Missouri, the years of territorial survey work that had taken him through Kansas and Colorado and into New Mexico. He told her about the satisfaction of accurate measurement, of knowing that the lines he drew on paper corresponded to something real, that the maps he made would mean something to the people who used them for decades after. "My mother always said that accurate maps were a form of honesty," Adelaide said. "Your mother was right," Gilbert said. "Most conflict I've seen in land disputes comes from bad maps, people defending boundaries that were never where anyone thought they were. Fences that crossed wrong lines because the original survey was done by someone who was in a hurry or didn't care about precision. Or was bribed," Adelaide said. "Or that," he agreed. "Did you ever refuse to falsify something?" He looked at her sideways. "Once," he said, "in Kansas, a rancher wanted the line moved 40 yards east. It would have taken a family's water access. I declined. He tried to find another surveyor." He paused. "I reported what I found to the land office anyway before he could find one." "What happened?" "He threatened me," Gilbert said. "Then he thought better of it. The family kept their water." Adelaide was quiet for a moment. The sky to the west was doing spectacular things with color, the kind of sunset the territory produced regularly, as if to compensate for all the dust and difficulty. "I keep waiting for the part where you turn out to be less than you seem," she said, not cruelly but candidly. "That's a reasonable thing to wait for," he said. "Most men stop being what they appeared to be at the beginning," she said. "They start performing, and then the performance becomes exhausting and you see what was underneath, and what's underneath is usually less. I'm not saying that to be uncharitable. It just seems to be a pattern." "It is a pattern," he agreed. "I've seen it in myself too, though I hope in the other direction. I think I'm somewhat better acquainted and more honestly presented over time than at the first impression, but that might be flattering myself." She glanced at him. "You just admitted a potential flaw, a minor one, the flaw being possibly unflattering myself rather than flattering. Most men would not have made that particular error in that direction," she said. "Most men are exhausting themselves maintaining an impression," he said. "I don't have the energy for it, and you'd see through it anyway." "I would," she said, without arrogance, just factually. They walked back to town when the stars were beginning to come out, and he walked her to the door of the store where she lived in the back apartment, an arrangement she had made when her mother died, and she took over the business so that she would not have to go back and forth in the dark, which was a practical decision she had made with entirely practical reasoning, and which had had the secondary effect of meaning she was fully independent for the first time in her life. At the door she turned and looked at him. "Thank you for the walk," she said. "Thank you for suggesting it," he said. There was a moment. It had weight to it without being heavy. It was the kind of moment that holds a question without asking it out loud. "Good night, Mr. Lockhart," she said. "Good night, Miss Finley," he said. Then, because they both knew the correct register here, "Adelaide." The corner of her mouth moved. "Gilbert," she said, and went inside. He stood outside for a moment in the warm dark, listening to the sounds of a small town settling into its evening, and he felt something he had not felt in a very long time, possibly ever in exactly this form, which was the sense of having met someone he could spend the rest of his life being genuinely interested in. The second week was the one where things changed between them, not dramatically, not with any single event, but with the accumulation of ordinary moments that, when stacked together, formed the foundation of something serious. He came to the store each morning. They talked, sometimes briefly and sometimes at length. She showed him additional documents from her mother's collection, not because he needed them all, though some were relevant, but because she had started to want to show him things, to watch his face when he encountered an idea he found interesting or a piece of information he had not expected. He discovered that she had taught herself basic astronomy from a book because she had wanted to understand celestial navigation, and then developed a genuine interest in it beyond the practical application. She knew the names of the major stars visible from their latitude and could identify most of them. And one evening she walked him out behind the store where the town lights were fewer and pointed things out with the particular pleasure of someone sharing something they love with someone they believe will love it too. He stood next to her in the dark looking up, and she was close enough that he could have put his arm around her shoulders without it being anything other than a natural continuation of the position they were already in. And he did not because he did not want to, but because he wanted to be patient. He wanted her to trust not just the version of him she had met in the first week, but the version that persisted after the initial impressiveness wore off, if there had been any impressiveness at all, which he doubted. She talked about her mother more. He listened each time with the same quality of attention, not the performative listening of a man who is waiting for his turn to speak, but the genuine listening of a man who is processing and remembering and connecting what he hears to what he already knows about her. She noticed this. It meant something to her. He had a difficult day midway through the second week, when the Santa Fe Company sent a letter through the post office that contained a revised set of requirements that would mean redoing 3 days of survey work, because someone in the Santa Fe office had decided to change the reference baseline without informing the man actually doing the measuring. He came into the store that afternoon with his jaw set and the particular controlled frustration of a careful man confronting careless administrators. Adelaide read the letter without comment when he handed it to her, which he had done because she was the most sensible person he knew in Dusk Creek, and sometimes you need to hand something to a sensible person and let them read it. "They changed the baseline," she said, "after I'd set 3 days of measurements from the old one." "Can you recalculate from your existing data?" He thought about it. "Some of it. The western parcels will need to be resurveyed. 2 days, probably. Write back and bill them for the additional time, she said, handing the letter back. At twice your standard rate since it's their administrative failure. He raised his eyebrows. They are a company, Gilbert. They respect clarity about costs. If you absorb the time without comment, they will regard it as precedent. She said this with the certainty of someone who had negotiated with wholesalers and supply companies and knew how institutional thinking worked. You do good work. Don't let them treat it as adjustable. He wrote the letter that evening at the desk in his room, and he wrote it with the confidence she had, in effect, lent him, because sometimes that is what one person does for another. They stand next to you, and you can think more clearly for having them nearby. The reply from Santa Fe, which came at the end of the following week, approved the additional billing without contest. The third week brought a complication from an unexpected direction. A man named Porter Haas rode into town, and he was the kind of man who arrived in a place and immediately gave it a slightly wrong feeling, the way a single off-key note makes an entire melody questionable. He was well-dressed after the fashion of someone who wanted to appear prosperous, not necessarily someone who was. He had easy charm of the kind that works primarily on people who have not met much of it. He said he was a land investment agent from Texas, though he was not specific about which office or which company. He introduced himself to Adelaide on his second morning in town, coming into the dry goods store and being very courteous and very attentive, and complimenting the organization of the store in a way that was not wrong exactly, but had the quality of a man who had identified what would be flattering and deployed it strategically rather than simply noticing something true. Adelaide received all of this with her standard, pleasant, entirely uncompromised directness. She answered his questions about town and territory, sold him the supplies he actually needed, and when he lingered past the point of commercial transaction and began making conversation of the personal variety, she was courteous but did not lean in. Gilbert happened to be in the store when this unfolded. He was at the back counter reviewing his notes while Adelaide managed the morning, and he watched Porter Haas without making it obvious that he was watching, which was a skill he had developed in years of professional work that required being able to observe a situation accurately while appearing to be focused on something else entirely. He did not feel jealousy, exactly. What he felt was closer to alertness, the way a man who has learned to read land feels the change in ground before he sees it. Something about Haas was not what it presented itself as, and the instinct that told Gilbert where survey boundaries actually fell was telling him the same thing about this man. That evening he mentioned it to Adelaide directly, which was something he felt able to do with her because they had established a communication that was honest. "Porter Haas was in your store today," he said. "He was," she said. They were sitting on the porch of the boarding house, which had become a regular thing on evenings when the weather was good, which in the territory in late spring was most evenings. "What did you make of him?" "Charming," she said. In the practiced way, she paused. "His compliments had the texture of calculations." "I thought the same thing," Gilbert said. "I don't know what he's after." "He asked questions about the Dahlen land," Adelaide said. Framed as casual curiosity, but specific enough to be intentional. Gilbert sat up straighter. "The Dahlen land is the most valuable parcel in the area if the railroad comes through, or the speculation suggests." "I know," she said, "and the Dahlens don't fully know that, and their boundary dispute means whoever gains the correct legal ground on that property before the railroad survey arrives is in an extremely favorable position." They looked at each other. If someone with accurate information about the true boundaries got to the Dahlens and offered to buy before the railroad survey confirmed the value, Gilbert said slowly, they could make a significant profit on a deal the Dahlens would later regret, Adelaide finished. That's if the buyer was unscrupulous and the information was being used that way. Gilbert was quiet for a moment. My survey work could be the source of that information. My preliminary measurements are already showing what the accurate boundaries look like. Who else has access to your notes? No one, he said. but the Santa Fe company will receive the complete report, and they have their own internal communications. So someone who had a connection to someone inside the Santa Fe company could theoretically— Yes, he said. Can you verify Haas's affiliation with any land company? I'll write to a contact in Santa Fe tomorrow, he said. He knows the land agents operating in the territory. She nodded. Then she said quietly, You didn't just dismiss it. You didn't tell me I was reading too much into a man being friendly. You have better judgment about people than anyone I've met, he said. Why would I dismiss your read? She was quiet for a moment. The town was settling into night around them. Oil lamps going on in windows, the sound of horses from the direction of the saloon a block over, the distant call of something wild from the dark country beyond the last building on the north side. Most of the men I've encountered in my life, she said carefully, have believed that my capability was something to be admired in a particular contained way, as if it were an impressive feature like a good barn or a strong horse, rather than just who I am. They admire it and then try to work around it when it inconveniences them. I know, he said. I've seen that pattern with other men too, if it helps. Men who respect your accounting but feel personally challenged when your accounting catches their error. It helps a little, she said, but it also makes me tired in advance at the thought of it. You don't have to be tired in advance of me, he said. I know that's a large thing to say, but I want to say it clearly so it's on record. She turned to look at him. In the lamplight from the boarding house window, her face was serious and entirely open, which he understood was not a thing she offered easily. You are either exactly what you appear to be, she said, which would make you genuinely remarkable, or you are a very sophisticated performance, which would also make you remarkable, just in a different direction. I am not sophisticated, he said. I'm thorough, there's a difference. She laughed then, a genuine, unguarded laugh, and it was one of the most important sounds he had ever heard, because he understood in that moment that he had been given something real. The letter back from his contact in Santa Fe arrived 4 days later. Porter Haas was not affiliated with any recognized land company in the territory. He had been involved in 2 prior deals in eastern Texas that had resulted in complaints filed with the state land office, both involving sellers who had been underpaid for property, whose actual value Haas had possessed prior knowledge of. Neither complaint had resulted in prosecution because the sellers had agreed to civil settlements in exchange for small additional payments, and Haas had moved on. Gilbert brought the letter to Adelaide the morning it arrived. She read it twice, folded it, and set it on the counter with the focused attention of someone deciding what comes next. The Dallens need to know, she said. I'll ride out today, he said. I'll come with you, she said. She said it simply as a statement of intention, not a request for permission, and Gilbert said, I was going to ask, which was true. They rode out to the Dahlen land together, Adelaide on her bay mare who she handled with the same matter-of-fact competence she brought to everything, and Marcus Dahlen came out of his house with his familiar suspicious expression that softened somewhat when he recognized the horse and its rider. Adelaide did the explaining, which was the correct choice because Marcus Dahlen trusted her, had bought supplies from her store for years, and knew her to be honest. She was precise and clear about what the letter said, what Haas had done before, and what the probable plan was. Marcus listened without interrupting, which for Marcus Dahlen was significant. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, What do we do? Don't sell anything to anyone until Gilbert's survey is complete and on record with the land office, she said. Once the boundaries are correctly filed, the land's actual value is a matter of record. You negotiate from knowledge, not from someone else's framing of what you have. And Haas, he hasn't actually done anything unlawful yet in your case, she said, but I would suggest not letting him past your fence. Marcus Dahlen nodded slowly. He looked at Gilbert. She always like this, he said. From what I understand, yes, Gilbert said. Marcus Dahlen looked back at Adelaide and said, with the gruff sincerity of a man who is not practiced at gratitude but means it, Your mother would have been proud of you. Adelaide held that for a moment. "I hope so," she said. "She was the one who taught me to read the land documents in the first place." Porter Haas left Dusk Creek 2 days later, which was shortly after Orson Beat at the livery stable told him, in the unhurried way of a man who does not mind how his words land, that the surveyor in town had been in correspondence with land offices in 2 territories, and that the Dollans had recently acquired legal consultation, and that the whole situation was becoming considerably less interesting for outside investment than it had perhaps appeared. Haas did not confront anyone. He simply was not there one morning. The town registered this with a collective shrug and moved on. The 4th week was when Adelaide and Gilbert moved from something unspoken, but acknowledged, to something spoken and declared. And it happened the way true things often happen in real life, not with orchestration, but with a moment that found its own opening. He had finished the western parcel surveys and was moving to the final complicated section along the river, and this required early starts and late returns, and he did not always make it to the store in the mornings. This absence, which was purely practical, had the effect on both of them that practical absences sometimes have. It clarified what had been gradually becoming clear anyway, which was that their mornings together had become something they both oriented their days around. When he came in on a Thursday after 2 days of river survey work, dusty and tired and smelling of sun and effort, she was behind the counter and she looked up from her ledger, and the expression on her face before she composed it into her usual directness was enough to tell him everything he already suspected. "You look like the Picos gave you trouble," she said. "The Picos gave everyone trouble this week," he said. "The bank is unstable in 3 places the existing maps show as solid ground. I've been restaking and remeasuring since Tuesday. Come to the back," she said. "I have coffee." He followed her to the back office, and she poured coffee, and they sat across from each other at the work table, and he told her about the river survey complications, and she listened and asked sensible questions, and somewhere in the middle of an explanation about the sediment layers in the problematic bank sections, he stopped talking mid-sentence because she was looking at him in the way that meant something entirely different from interest in river sediment, and he set down his coffee cup and said, "Adelaide." "Yes," she said, not as an answer but as an acknowledgement that she knew what he was about to say. "I need to tell you something directly," he said, "because I believe you prefer directness." "I do," she said. "I have spent my adult life," he said, "moving through a fairly considerable number of places and working with a fairly considerable number of people, and I have never once felt that a place or a person was exactly right for my life until I arrived in Dusk Creek and met you. I want to be honest about the degree of certainty I feel about this, which is unusual for me, because I am a man who measures things twice and states conclusions conservatively." She was very still. "I understand this is a significant thing to say," he continued. "I understand that you have been through a version of this with other men, and that the version they offered was not actually what you needed and that you have good reason to be careful. I am not asking you to accept anything right now. I am asking you to know that I mean this and that I am not going anywhere, and that if you want to take time to establish the truth of that, I have time to give." Adelaide sat with that for a moment. The morning light came through the east window and landed on the papers between them and on her hands resting on the table and on her face, which was doing something complex and quiet and real. "I have told myself," she said slowly, "for several years now that the right approach was to have a full life of my own and not require anyone else to complete it. And I believe that is still true. I have a full life. I am not incomplete without you." She paused. "But I am aware, very specifically aware, that the last 4 weeks have been richer and more interesting and more genuinely pleasant than any other 4-week period I can readily identify, and I think the honest accounting of that points at you fairly directly." "I will take that honest accounting," he said. "I am not easy to be with," she said. "I don't mean that as warning so much as full information. I have opinions that I do not moderate for politeness. I have a business that I run my way. I read legal documents for entertainment, and I can identify most of the major stars, and I have strong views on the territorial water rights situation that not everyone finds charming. I will not make myself smaller. I know all of that, he said. None of it is a problem. All of it is why I'm sitting here. She looked at him for a long moment. Outside, the morning was moving along, Dusk Creek doing its ordinary things, horses and voices and the sound of commerce. And in this small back office with its organized cabinet of legal documents and the smell of coffee and old paper and the territory morning, Adelaide Finley decided to do something she had not previously been willing to do, which was to trust the thing she felt without waiting for it to be disproven first. "All right," she said. It was not a dramatic declaration. It was not a speech. It was one word from a woman who did not spend words carelessly, and it landed accordingly. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers, and she turned her hand so their fingers interlaced, and they stayed that way for a moment, while the morning light moved slightly on the table, and the sounds of the town continued outside, and everything was both entirely the same and fundamentally different. The weeks that followed were the happiest of Gilbert Lockhart's life up to that point, and he was aware of this while it was happening rather than only in retrospect, which he understood was a gift not everyone received. He completed the survey work. The Dahlem boundary dispute was resolved in the manner Adelaide had predicted. Once the accurate measurements were filed with the land office, and the relevant congressional documentation was properly cited, the resolution was straightforward enough that even the circuit judge, who Adelaide had accurately described as prone to the condescending, could manage it without additional complication. Marcus Dahlem received the additional 50 feet of eastern boundary that were rightfully his, and his neighbor received clear title to his western parcels, without the long-standing cloud that had been affecting his ability to borrow against them. And both men came separately to the store to tell Adelaide they were grateful. Gilbert sent his completed survey report to Santa Fe. The company wrote back with approval and a request for 2 additional parcels along the northern edge of the territory, which would take another 3 weeks. He went to Rupert Finley the evening after the Santa Fe letter arrived. Rupert was on the porch of the boarding house in his customary chair, and Gilbert sat in the other chair and said, without preamble, "I would like to ask your daughter to marry me. I want to tell you before I ask her, not because I require your permission, she is a grown woman and makes her own decisions, but because you're her father and I respect you, and I want you to know what my intentions are before she does." Rupert Finley was quiet for a long moment. The evening sky was doing its usual spectacular thing over the territory, purple and orange, and the first stars beginning to appear in the east where Adelaide had shown Gilbert their names. "She'll say yes," Rupert said finally. "I hope so," Gilbert said. "I know so," Rupert said, "because I know my daughter and I know that she has been telling me you're interesting without meaning to, the way she talks about you when she's talking about other things, the way you come up in conversations where you weren't strictly relevant." He paused. "She talks about interesting things that way, problems she's working on, books she's reading, plants along the creek that she hasn't identified yet. She doesn't talk about people that way unless they matter." "She matters to me," Gilbert said. "I know," Rupert said. "You passed the test I set when you arrived, though I didn't tell you I was setting it." "What test was that?" "I told you the truth about her. All the men who came before you, I gave the standard greeting and let them find out on their own. With you, I sat on this porch and told you the truth about what she was before you'd even met her. And you said that was the kind of woman you'd been looking for." He looked at Gilbert with the direct appraisal of a man who has been watching and waiting for a long time. "You meant it, and then you went and proved it." "I just behaved consistently," Gilbert said. "That is almost impossibly rare," Rupert said. "Son, you have my wholehearted blessing. And my eternal relief, because I was beginning to worry she'd outlive me alone, which she would have survived perfectly well. She's the most capable person I know, but a parent wants more than survival for their child." The following Sunday morning, Gilbert found Adelaide behind the store in the small kitchen garden. She maintained with the same systematic attention she gave everything. A kitchen garden that was also a small demonstration of thinking, with the plants arranged according to soil need and sunlight pattern and harvest rotation, rather than by what looked decorative. She was on her knees with a trowel doing something purposeful to the base of a tomato plant, and she looked up when she heard him and said, "Good morning," with the particular tone she had for him now, warm and direct in equal measure. "Good morning," he said. He stood at the edge of the garden. He had his hat in his hands, and he was aware that he had not been nervous about much in the last several years, and that he was, at this moment, nervous, which told him something important about how much this mattered. "You have a look about you," she said, sitting back on her heels and reading him with her usual accuracy. "I have something to say," he said. She set down the trowel. She looked at him. "I am going to be in the territory for another 3 weeks of survey work," he said. "After that, my obligation to the company in Santa Fe is complete, and I will have some choices to make about what comes next. I am telling you this because I want you to understand that everything I am about to say is not contingent on the survey work or the company or any temporary circumstance. I want to say it now because I know what I know, and I see no reason to delay saying it." She was very still in the way she was still when something mattered. "I love you," he said. It was clean and simple, and he said it looking directly at her. "I love your mind and your honesty and the way you have organized both your life and that garden according to actual logic rather than convention. I love that you read congressional acts for pleasure, and that you know the names of the stars, and that you repaired your own cuff with approximately correct thread without caring whether it matched exactly. I love that you are completely and fully yourself without apology and without calculation." He paused. "I would like very much to be your husband if you are willing. I would like to stay in Dusk Creek if you want to stay here, or go somewhere else if you want to go, and if you decide after more time that you don't want either of those things, I will respect that. But I wanted to ask now clearly, because I believe in clear statements and I believe in you." Adelaide sat on her heels in her kitchen garden in the territory morning and looked at him for a moment that felt longer than it was, and he could see her processing it, not deciding, he understood, because he suspected the decision had been made before today, but making sure she was receiving it accurately, reading the words as they were meant rather than as they had been offered by other men who had meant less. "Gilbert," she said. "Yes. You are going to have to put up with a great deal of my opinions." "I have been looking forward to nothing more," he said. "I will not stop running the store. I would never suggest it. I may want to file a legal challenge to the bar examination requirements in this territory within the next few years, which will be controversial and potentially protracted. I will help you research the case if you want a research partner," he said. She stood up. She had garden dirt on her hands and her knees and a small smear of it on her cheek that she was not aware of, and she walked to the edge of the garden and looked at him at close range. "Yes," she said, "I will marry you. And I want you to know that I am saying it because I want to, not because you asked, which you already know, but I want to say it clearly anyway." "I know," he said. "I love that you said it that way." She reached up and put her hand against his face, dirt and all, and he put his hands on her waist. And when they kissed, it was the kind of kiss that tells you everything you needed to know about the person you are kissing, warm and honest and absolutely certain. Rupert Finley appeared at the kitchen door immediately, with a speed that suggested he had been nearby, and when he saw them standing together in the garden, he let out a long, slow breath that had apparently been stored up for some time, and then he went back inside to put the coffee on. The remaining 3 weeks of survey work passed in a different light entirely. Gilbert worked with the same thoroughness and precision he always brought, but the evenings were different, and the mornings were different, and the whole quality of moving through each day was different in the way that things are different when you know where you are going. Adelaide told him things in those evenings that she had not told him before, not because she had been withholding them, but because They were the kind of things that wait until a person is sure of the ground they are standing on. She told him about the year after her mother died, the weight of it, the way she had risen every morning into grief and gone downstairs into the store, and faced the day because the day required facing, and the business required someone to run it, and she was the person available, and she had done it because there was no other option, and how doing it had eventually become not a burden but a foundation, something she had built that was genuinely hers. She told him that for a long time after that she had been afraid that needing anyone else would mean being vulnerable to the kind of loss that had already been, and how she had decided it was better to be complete alone than incomplete and dependent. But that's not the choice, is it? She said. The real choice. It's not between complete alone and incomplete with someone. No, he said. It's between complete alone and complete together. And the second one requires finding someone who doesn't need you to make yourself smaller to make room for them. She looked at him. You can survey a lot more territory if two people are looking. Exactly. They were married in the last week of June, in 1882, in the small white church at the north end of Dusk Creek's Main Street, which was the only church in town, and which the congregation shared with two other denominations on a rotating schedule. The minister was not the traveling minister who had once tried to court Adelaide, which everyone agreed was for the best. This one was a local man named Reverend Caleb, who was in his 50s, and had married half the town, and buried the other half, and performed both services with equal dignity. Adelaide wore her best dress, which she had spent 3 evenings altering, and which fit her perfectly, because she was as precise about sewing as she was about everything else, and it was a deep amber color that in the church light looked like something between gold and fire. Gilbert wore the best suit he owned, which he had obtained in Abilene before the trip to New Mexico, and which still fit because he was the kind of man whose size and shape were consistent, and Rupert Finley had somehow found flowers for the church despite the fact that it was a dry year, which was the kind of thing that happens when a community likes you. Clem Hatcher was there and shook Gilbert's hand with genuine warmth and said, "I knew somebody would figure it out eventually." Orson Beat from the livery came and stood in the back with the expression of a man who has just been proven wrong in a way that pleases him. Marcus Dolan rode in from the east boundary and sat in the third row with his hat on his knee and looked the most civilized anyone had ever seen him. The ceremony was the traditional words, because Adelaide did not require the ceremony to be unconventional. She had nothing to prove about who she was. The ceremony was simply the moment of public declaration, and public declarations have their own proper form. But when Reverend Caleb reached the part about honor and cherish, both Adelaide and Gilbert looked at each other with the particular directness they had from the very beginning, and the congregation, which had been watching this whole story develop over 2 months with the focused attention small towns apply to love stories, made a collective internal sound that was as close to unanimous as anything in Dusk Creek had ever been. Rupert Finley cried. He did it quietly and did not make anything of it, but it was visible, and Adelaide turned to look at him from the altar and held his gaze for a moment with an expression that said everything that needed saying about who she had been and who she was now, and how these things were not different but continuous. After the wedding, they had a dinner at the boarding house with the people who mattered, and Rupert had spent 2 days cooking, assisted intermittently by Mrs. Osgood the milliner's wife, who was a better baker than any establishment in 3 counties, and there was food enough for 3 times the number of people present, and conversation that went on until the territory dark was deep and full of stars that Adelaide could name. Gilbert had accepted a position with the New Mexico Territory Land Office in Santa Fe, which had been offered when his survey report was received and recognized as exceptional work. It was a permanent position with a salary, and it meant regular work and regular presence, which was what both of them wanted. Adelaide kept the store, and she and Gilbert had discussed the possibility that over time, as the territory grew and more people settled around Dusk Creek, the store's business might grow into something that required additional staff. They had discussed this in the practical and forward-looking way they discussed everything, mapping out the future the way Gilbert mapped land carefully, with attention to what was actually there rather than what was wished for. They stayed in Dust Creek. Adelaide lived in the apartment behind the store and Gilbert moved in, which meant the apartment gained a surveying kit and several crates of map documents, and a man who rose early and made coffee with the same precision he brought to measuring. And the apartment became a home of the specific kind that is built between two people who are genuinely interested in each other's company rather than merely tolerating each other's presence. Rupert Finley kept the boarding house and came to dinner on Tuesdays, a pattern that had survived the transition from courtship to marriage intact, and these Tuesday dinners were among the most reliable pleasures of everyone's week. By October of 1882, the railroad survey team arrived in the territory, as had been expected, and the accurate maps Gilbert had produced served as the primary reference document, which meant the Dahlin land's value was correctly assessed, and Marcus Dahlin was able to negotiate from full knowledge, and concluded an arrangement for a right-of-way crossing that was fair, and left him in a better financial position than he had occupied for 11 years. Marcus Dahlin came to the store to tell Adelaide when the arrangement was signed, and she congratulated him with genuine pleasure, and he said, gruffly but unmistakably, "Your mother's documents made the difference," and Adelaide held that for a moment and then said, "Yes, I expect she knew they would." In the winter of 1882, moving into early 1883, Adelaide began the early work on her legal challenge regarding the bar examination. She had located 2 other women in the territory who were in similar positions, educated in law, unable to sit the exam, and they were corresponding by letter with increasing frequency and building a case document that Adelaide maintained with the same organizational precision as her commercial ledgers. Gilbert read the developing case document each time she added to it and offered his own observations and helped her find additional precedents. And on the evenings when the argument was frustrating or the institutional inertia seemed particularly impenetrable, he sat with her and said the things that needed saying, which were usually some version of, "The argument is sound, the work is real, and the fact that the opposition is entrenched is evidence of the threat you pose, not the weakness of your position." She had learned to receive this from him without deflecting it, which had taken a little time, because she was more accustomed to giving support than receiving it. He was patient about this in the way he was patient about most things, with the particular patience of a man who understood that some territories needed to be approached gradually rather than all at once. In the spring of 1883, they discovered that Adelaide was expecting a child. She told him on a Tuesday morning, standing in the back office of the store with the east light coming through the window, and she told him in the direct way she told him everything important, without hedging or dramatizing, simply stating the fact and watching his face. He sat down, which he did not normally do in response to information, and then he stood back up, and then he looked at her with an expression that she would describe to her father later that evening as the best thing she had ever seen on a human face. "Are you glad?" she asked, because she wanted to know, not because she doubted it. "Adelaide," he said, "I am so glad that I don't currently have words for it, and I'm a man who has always had words." She smiled. "Then I am glad too," she said. "I was already glad, but I wanted to know with certainty that you were." "With complete certainty," he said. He came around the work table and put his arms around her, and she leaned into him, and they stood in the morning light in the store where her mother had taught her to read land documents and her father had brought her as a small girl to learn the weight and texture of commerce, and where she had built her own life from the raw material of loss and capability and stubbornness and love. The pregnancy was healthy. Adelaide continued running the store through most of it, because she was capable and the work was not physically prohibitive, and also because she found the routine grounding. She modified some tasks and accepted help with the heavier stock, without making it a point of pride, because she was practical and pride about the wrong things was something she had never had patience for. She organized the back apartment with the same systematic intelligence she brought to everything, making space for what would be needed, arranging the furniture so that the flow of the room was logical, preparing things in a way that showed she had thought about what actually would be useful rather than what was conventional. Rupert Finley, upon being told he would be a grandfather, sat down on his porch chair with the expression of a man who has received more good news than he was structurally prepared for, and then laughed, and then wiped his eyes, and then said, "Your mother always said she wanted grandchildren more than anything." And Adelaide sat beside him and took his hand, and they were quiet together for a while in the way of two people who carry the same absence. In November of 1883, their son was born. He was a strong, healthy boy, born in the territory Dawn, and they named him Samuel Rupert Lockhart, for the father and grandfather who were the best men they knew. Rupert Finley was at the boarding house when word came and walked down to the store apartment in the early morning light with his eyes very bright, and when he was let in and brought to where Adelaide lay with the baby, he stood for a long time just looking, in the way of people who are measuring a joy that exceeds ordinary measurement. Samuel was a good-natured child from the beginning, which everyone took credit for in various ways. Clem Hatcher, who had married a sensible girl from the Mendoza family in the spring, and was developing into exactly the decent young man his good nature had always suggested he would become, came to see the baby and said, with the earnest completeness that was his defining characteristic, "He has your eyes, Adelaide, and his father's expression, which I think means he will be both observant and calm, and that is a good combination." Adelaide said she hoped so. The store continued to grow. By 1884, they had taken on a part-time assistant, a capable young woman named Petra Sandoval, who had come to Dusk Creek with her family from the South, and who had the same natural aptitude for organization that Adelaide possessed, and who Adelaide trained with the same directness she applied to everything. Petra learned the ledger system, the inventory rotation, the negotiation approach with the wholesalers, and blossomed under the weight of genuine expectation in the way that good people do when they are treated as capable. Gilbert's work with the land office continued to grow in scope as well. The territory's development accelerated through 1883 and 1884 as the railroad pushed further, and more people arrived seeking to establish homes and businesses on land that was still being defined in law and fact simultaneously. His survey reports were used in 3 separate legal decisions during this period, 2 of which Adelaide had helped him think through in terms of how the reports would function in a legal argument. She was building toward her bar case. She corresponded with a woman lawyer in the East, one of the small number, who had been permitted to practice in states with more progressive regulations, and was learning from her experience about both the legal argument and the political maneuvering required. It was slow work, the kind of work that moved mostly underground for a long time before it broke the surface, and Adelaide approached it with the same patience she brought to the kitchen garden, doing the necessary preparation in the knowledge that the growth would come when the conditions were right. Rupert Finley, who had been a presence in all of this, the Tuesday dinners, the walks, the occasional afternoon in the store when trade was slow, fell ill in the winter of 1884, with the kind of illness that a man of 62 faces with the knowledge that the territory of remaining time is not unlimited. It was his chest, a weakness that had been building for 2 years and that the local doctor treated with the best tools of the period, which were not extensive but were given with genuine care and attention. Adelaide nursed him through the worst weeks with a thoroughness and tenderness that was, Gilbert understood, the mirror image of everything her father had given her, all the support and the belief, and the good humor and the steadfast presence that had allowed her to become who she was. She was at the boarding house every morning, managing his care alongside the store and the baby and the letter correspondence for the legal challenge, And she did it all without complaint or collapse, which was not because she was impervious, but because she was the kind of person who rises to meet what is required of them and mourns the cost of it privately. Gilbert was beside her through all of it. He took Samuel in the mornings when Adelaide went to her father, and he managed the domestic side of things without requiring acknowledgement, and he sat with her in the evenings when they were back in the apartment, Samuel asleep in his crib, and he let her talk about her father or sit in silence depending on what she needed, and he was simply and entirely there in the way that a person who loves you is there when the ground is uncertain. Rupert improved in early spring. It was not a complete recovery. His chest remained weaker than it had been, but he returned to the porch and to the Tuesday dinners, and to the capacity to look at his daughter and his grandson and his son-in-law, and find the kind of deep and ordinary contentment that is the best thing a life can produce. He said to Gilbert one afternoon, when Adelaide was inside with Samuel and they were on the porch in the spring warmth, "I sat on this porch and warned you about her. You remember what you said." "I said that was the kind of woman I had been looking for," Gilbert said. "You meant it entirely." "Entirely," Gilbert said. Most men who came through and heard that warning took it as a reason to tread carefully, to assess whether she was worth the effort, to weigh her capability against their own comfort. He was quiet for a moment. "You took it as a recommendation." "It was the most accurate recommendation anyone has ever given me," Gilbert said. Rupert nodded slowly, his eyes on the street, the town, the territory afternoon. "She would have been fine without you," he said. "That is the truth. She would have run the store and pursued the bar case and raised the boy and been the most capable and admired woman in the county, and she would have been fine." "I know," Gilbert said. "But fine is not the same as this," Rupert said. He gestured slightly, meaning not any specific thing but all of it, the store with its growing business, the Tuesday dinners, Samuel in the apartment learning to walk along the furniture with the focused determination of a child who intends to get somewhere, Adelaide in the evening with her case documents and her star charts and her clear, direct love. "This is better than fine." "Yes," Gilbert said, "it is." The spring of 1885 brought a development in the bar case. The territorial legislature was considering a revision to the examination regulations, pushed partly by the work of Adelaide and her two correspondents, and partly by the political pressure of several territorial judges who had come, in recent years, to recognize the shortage of competent legal practitioners, was a genuine problem that excluding half the population made significantly worse. Adelaide traveled to Santa Fe in March of 1885 to present testimony before the legislative committee considering the revision. Gilbert came with her, and Samuel came with them, because they traveled as a family, and Samuel was old enough to manage the journey and young enough to be curious about everything along the way. The hearing was in the legislative building, a formal and slightly intimidating space that Adelaide walked into with the posture and the focus of a woman who had been preparing for this exact moment for 3 years. She presented her case. She was precise and clear, and she anticipated every objection because she had already thought through all the objections herself, multiple times, and had answers for them that were legally grounded and practically supported. Gilbert sat in the gallery with Samuel on his knee and watched her, and the expression on his face was one that anyone watching him would have recognized as love in its most complete form, the kind that has been tested and confirmed and settled into something as reliable as bedrock. The committee did not decide that day, because committees rarely do, but the chairman asked to retain a copy of her written brief, which was the procedural sign that the argument had been taken seriously. And outside the building Adelaide stood in the Santa Fe afternoon with her hands clasped, and her eyes bright, and Gilbert put his arm around her, and she leaned into him, and Samuel said, in the developing vocabulary of an almost 2-year-old, "Mama talk," which made them both laugh out of all proportion to its objective humor. The territorial bar revision was approved in September of 1885. It was not a complete victory. The revised regulations still contained restrictions that Adelaide and her correspondents immediately began preparing to challenge, but the path was opened, and in the spring of 1886, Adelaide Lockhart, as she now appeared in all official documents, sat the New Mexico Territory bar examination. She was the second woman to do so in the territory. She passed it with the highest score of the examination cycle. The circuit judge, the one who called her Miss Finley in a condescending way, heard about the score. He had the grace, or possibly just the pragmatism, to call at the store and offer congratulations, which Adelaide received with the same direct, pleasant, entirely uncompromised courtesy she extended to everyone. And when he left, Petra Sandoval, who had been behind the counter watching this, said, "Did that feel as good as it should have?" "Better," Adelaide said, "because I earned it accurately and he knows it." She did not immediately hang out a legal practice shingle. The store was still the foundation of the family's financial stability, and the legal work she began taking on was careful and selected. The boundary disputes and property filings where her knowledge and the documents her mother had collected made her uniquely positioned to help. She charged fair fees and kept meticulous records, and over the following years built a practice that ran alongside the store rather than replacing it, the two operations feeding each other the way good systems do. Their daughter was born in the winter of 1886, a year after the Santa Fe hearing and 6 months after the bar passage, which Adelaide observed was good timing. They named her Clara Josephine Lockhart, for Adelaide's mother whose name had been Clara, and for the territory that had grown them both. She came into the world in the same apartment behind the store as her brother, in the December dark, and she was immediately and obviously a person of strong opinions and considerable presence, which anyone could have predicted, and no one minded in the least. Samuel, who was 3 years old, examined his sister with the serious thoroughness of a child who has been raised in an environment where thorough examination is the standard response to new information, and declared her acceptable, which Adelaide told Gilbert was the highest praise she had observed Samuel give anything. They were, by this time, deeply settled in Dusk Creek, which was itself growing and changing around them, more families arriving as the territory developed, the main street lengthening by 2 blocks in both directions, new buildings going up, a schoolhouse established that Samuel would eventually attend, and where Adelaide would be called upon to provide legal consultation regarding the school's property rights twice in the following decade. Rupert Finley's health had stabilized into a steady reduced capacity. He was slower and his chest tired easily, but he was still himself, still on the porch on good afternoons, still at Tuesday dinners, still telling the story about the mule in Colorado to anyone who had not heard it. Samuel had heard it many times and requested it with the regularity of a child who loves a familiar story, not because it is new, but because its repetition is its own kind of comfort. The store continued to grow under Petra's increasingly skilled management, which allowed Adelaide to shift more of her time to the legal practice as the years moved forward, though she maintained her involvement in the business that had been her mother's and her own, and that remained the visible evidence of what she had built from loss and capability. Gilbert surveyed the territory and watched it change under his instruments, the lines he drew becoming the records that would define ownership and dispute for generations, and he came home each evening to a house that was exactly as alive as the woman who ran it, and to children who looked at the world with the same measuring, curious directness their mother did, and to a life that was more than he had known to want when he had set out from Abilene with his leather satchel and his letter of introduction. On a Tuesday evening in the spring of 1887, when Samuel was 3.5 and Clara was 4 months old, and Rupert was at the table telling the Colorado mule story for what might have been the 40th time, and Adelaide was nursing Clara and laughing at her father's embellishments to the story, which grew slightly with each telling in ways that served the story rather than the facts. Gilbert sat at the table and looked at all of it, the lamp light, the faces he loved. the room that held all the particular history of this specific life, and felt the particular fullness that has no adequate name in any language, but which every person who is genuinely lucky eventually encounters if they are paying attention. He was paying attention. He had always paid attention. It was the thing that made him good at his work and better at his life. Adelaide looked across the table at him, and the look she gave him was the one she had from their very beginning: direct, intelligent, warm, entirely her own. And in it was everything they had built together. The documents and the surveys and the bar case and the store and the children and the Tuesday dinners and the walks along the dry creek bed and the nights under the territory stars when she pointed out the names, and he listened as if each one was a gift, which it was. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers. She turned her hand so their fingers interlaced, the way they had in the back office on that morning when everything changed, and the ordinary world became the one they were going to live in together for the rest of their lives. Outside, the territory evening came down slow and orange over Dusk Creek, over the main street and the store on the corner, and the boarding house porch where Rupert Finley had once sat and waited to see if any man would hear the truth about his daughter and choose her not in spite of it but because of it. And beyond the town the land ran out in every direction toward the mountains and the river and the sky, all of it now accurately mapped, the lines clear, the territory known, held in the careful and honest record of a man who had come looking for the exact thing he found. The mule story reached its Colorado conclusion to general applause. Clara woke briefly and looked at the lamplight with the focused curiosity of a person who had only been here 4 months and was already taking inventory, and Samuel said, seriously and without prompting, "Papa, when I am big I want to make maps." Gilbert said, "Then I'll teach you," Adelaide said, "and I'll teach you the law that governs what the maps describe." Samuel appeared to find this arrangement entirely satisfactory. Rupert Finley poured the good whiskey, the small amount of it that his doctor permitted and that was therefore rationed like treasure, and raised his glass. "To the territory," he said. They raised their glasses. "And to the people in it," Adelaide said. "And to the ones who figured out how to find each other in it," Gilbert added. They drank. The evening went on. The territory held them, all of them, steady as good survey work, clear as a map made with care and love and the full commitment of someone who meant to tell the truth about what was there.